Kia ora koutou katoa. Aotearoa, second half of the 19th century, was a place of war. Much land was taken from Māori by new settlers through dodgy deals, false promises, and often by force. Many Māori responded to this violence violently, and which in turn was met with further violence. In the 1870s, the Parihaka settlement in Taranaki became a focal point for Māori seeking a different response than violence. People travelled to Parihaka on the 18th and 19th of each month to talk about the issues they were facing, consider their response. Under the leadership of Te Whiti and Tohu, a decision was made to put aside the past practices of vengeance and revenge. It was realized that nothing would come of reverting to violence, but yet it was still important to resist the injustice of land confiscations and the loss of control of their land. Back in March 17, 1860, the first shots were fired in the so-called Taranaki Wars over a disputed land sale. Then in 1865, the Parihaka settlement was established by Te Whiti and Tohu. And in 1866, Te Whiti ordered weapons to be put aside, never to be seen again. He said, and I quote, "Go, put your hand to the plough, look not back. If any come with guns, be not afraid. If they smite you, smite not in return. If they rend you, be not discouraged. Another will take up your good work." They drew on stories from the Hebrew Bible of escaping from slavery in Egypt. They developed a strategy of non-violent resistance. Instead of fighting the soldiers and surveyors who were preparing confiscated lands for sale, the people of Parihaka sent out the ploughmen to cultivate the land and workers to build fences. The first ploughmen were arrested but offered no resistance. Others came to take their place and they too were arrested. More took their place. The New Zealand Parliament passed laws, special laws, to enable the ploughmen of Parihaka to be imprisoned without charge. No trials were held. Some of these arrested ploughmen were sent as political prisoners to Dunedin and were forced to work on the construction of roads. And then on November the 5th, 1881, government troops invaded the settlement of Parihaka with an overwhelming show of force to arrest its leaders. The soldiers were met with singing, dancing, and the handing out of bread. 500 loaves had been baked for the occasion. The invaders, though, burnt homes and crops, destroyed livestock, imprisoned the leaders, and raped women. This is the story, the New Zealand story, our story, of Parihaka. 50 years before Gandhi's better-known non-violent resistance to the British control of India, Te Whiti and Tohu and the people of Parihaka found a peaceful way to strongly resist and protest the injustice in our land. However, the community of Parihaka today says the lessons of their tupuna, their ancestors, is found not only in their actions, but also in their process of empowering a community to come together to discuss the pressures they're experiencing and to look for a collective response to injustice. The monthly meetings at Parihaka begun by Te Whiti and Tohu in the 1870s, have been disrupted only during that 1880s time of invasion. The community continues even today to meet on the 18th and 19th of each month to discuss the issues now and to consider how to respond to them. The commemoration date for Parihaka is November the 5th. It's the date of Te Whiti Tohu, the day of plunder. So November the 5th is a reminder of injustice close to home, and faith and courage too close to home, and a history that is not past, but a call to the present to make the future better. In the church liturgical calendar, November the 1st is All Saints' Day, a day of light and hope that scatters the darkness, suffering and death of the past night, Halloween. It's a day of remembering the hope and courage of our ancestors, the saints, and a day to recommit to emulating such hope and courage in our time and place. For we too are saints and called to be saints. Last week I attended a lecture in the Midwest of the United States, such as the miracles of Zoom. It was an introduction to a new book, a collective effort of many church historians over a period of about 8 years, of re-examining the time between the death of Jesus, say 30 CE, and the beginning of Christianity, say the end of the 2nd century CE. Contrary to the mythic master narrative, that's a narrative that says shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples are resurrected, empowered to go forth and establish the church by passing down the truth that Jesus taught in a correct and unified way. Contrary to that narrative, the evidence seems to suggest a very diverse picture, diverse in thought, diverse in practice, diverse in mission. What we have in our Acts 2 reading today is a 2nd century idyllic portrait of a Jesus group or association club. They met in homes, had a common meal, and as Jews were faithful to Jewish traditions. But things like using prescribed prayers and communally sharing property and unified in their devotion to the apostles' teaching, as that reading in Acts 2 seems to say, is likely anachronistic. The words read back. What the new book reveals is that Jesus groups experimented. Some experimented with forms of communal living other than the normative patriarchal model. And that's what that Acts 2 reading points to. Some experimented with women and men having different roles than those in patriarchal society, women being leaders, for example. Some experimented with meals, what would become communion, and bathing, what would become baptism. The context of the Jesus groups was not dissimilar to the context of Te Whiti and Tohu. Namely, they were living in a time of resistance to a regime's overwhelming violence and dominant ideology. Meeting the violence of the empire with a violence response, while understandable, was not a path taken by the Jesus groups, as was not a path taken by the Parihaka people. Instead, the Jesus groups developed countermeasures. And for them, these countermeasures included developing a different understanding of family. The Roman Empire was built on the patriarchal family. And encouraging leadership regardless of one's class. Even slaves could be leaders. Jesus groups experimented with social organization as a means to both subvert and resist the empire. To give an example, in a little book called The Shepherd of Hermas, written in the 2nd century, we think the Jesus group called themselves the enslaved of God. In doing so, they were taking the stigma of slavery and applying it to all the believers in their group. It's a kind of #MeToo moment. The conclusion of this new book is that the early Jesus groups were flexible, anti-imperial, creative, and multi-directional. They also didn't have most of the things we today associate with church. They had no church buildings, no pews, no organs, no pulpits. They also had no clergy, no creeds, no orthodoxy, and almost no liturgies. The challenge of all this today is that, given continuing injustice in many forms, think prisons, poverty, racism, sexism, etc., and given the structures of society that aid injustice, like the interlocking systems that continue to keep prisons alive and thriving and growing, and poverty alive and thriving, how will we, as the Jesus group, respond as the power and influence we've had in the past continues to wane? What I mean by power waning is that the tide has gone out on the norm of Christian allegiance. It's gone out on Christian values being dominant in the public sphere, and of course on church membership and attendance. This is the reality of our days. So how do we respond with experimental willingness and the concurrent likelihood of many failures that our Jesus forebears had? Te Whiti and Tohu shared leadership. I note how the older books often try to make Te Whiti the leader and Tohu the assistant. Shared leadership in itself is a resistant strategy. What is our shared church leadership strategy? And is it working? Tohu and Te Whiti also set aside time to meet and eat and talk regularly, the 18th and 19th of each month. Today we frequently prefer to hear from leaders, like clergy, rather than take time to hear and listen deeply to each other. Maybe we should experiment with meeting for 2 full days each month, instead of weekly on a Sunday morning. It is in the meeting and talking and eating that those dreams and schemes of resistance will be born.